Sheriff Daniels had no idea the elderly woman behind the wheel was carrying a nation's secret. An hour later, he stood frozen as a black SUV pulled up. Its passenger would change everything. But first, tell me where you're watching from, and hit like if you believe honor must be earned, not demanded. Now let me take you back to the moment everything began unraveling. The late afternoon sun melted into the distant Alabama hills as an old Ford F-100 pickup truck rattled down a quiet country road. The paint was faded and the chrome dulled by years of dust and sunlight, but it moved with steady confidence, like it knew where it was going. Behind the wheel sat Miss Loretta May Hampton, 83 years old, wearing her Sunday best hat, pressed white blouse, and an expression of quiet dignity. Her eyes, hidden behind gold-rimmed glasses, were alert as ever. Her hair, neatly braided and pinned beneath her wide-brimmed hat, hinted at a woman raised in discipline and grace. Inside the cab, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old leather. On the dashboard sat a folded American flag, encased in a triangular glass box. It had been her husband, Sergeant First Class Alvin Hampton, who died in 1994. It was Memorial Day. She had just left the Veterans Cemetery where Alvin was buried, having laid flowers and whispered a few private words to the man who once walked beside her through decades of war, sacrifice, and survival. Loretta's truck creaked and groaned as it climbed the hill toward Oak Hollow Junction. She hummed softly an old hymn her mother used to sing while shelling peas on the front porch in Montgomery. Just as the road straightened, she glanced into the mirror and noticed flashing blue lights behind her. A police cruiser had appeared from nowhere. Following close, she didn't panic. She'd been stopped before, often in her younger years, when laws were not written to protect women like her. She had learned to carry herself with grace. Even when the world offered her anything but, she guided the truck slowly onto the gravel shoulder, careful to signal with her arm. Then she cut the engine and waited. From inside the police cruiser, Sheriff Matt Daniels, 37 years old, tapped his partner on the arm. "Get a load of that relic," he muttered. "Still kicking, huh?" Deputy Brett Coleman, barely 27 and new to the Oak Hollow County Sheriff's Office, leaned forward. "Looks like an antique. Who's even driving that thing?" Daniels smirked. "Let's find out." As Daniels approached the driver's window, Loretta rolled it down with deliberate calm. She kept both hands visible on the steering wheel. "Good afternoon, Sheriff," she said evenly. Daniels' eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Afternoon, Mum. License and registration, please." Loretta nodded politely. "May I ask what the reason for the stop is?" Daniels lowered his sunglasses, peering in at her face. "Your left taillight's cracked. Also, that this truck is barely roadworthy. You sure you should be out here driving, ma'am?" "I understand," Loretta said as she reached for her leather purse on the seat beside her. "Here's my license and vehicle papers." She handed him the documents. With a calm, practiced motion, Daniels took them without thanks. Coleman, now peering through the passenger window, gestured toward a rectangular metal case on the floor. It was sleek, gunmetal gray, and marked with faint military etchings barely visible. "What's in the case?" he asked. Loretta's voice didn't waver. "Classified contents. I'm an authorized custodian." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Classified? Huh. You military?" "Yes. Retired." She paused. "United States Army. Colonel." Daniels let out a soft chuckle. "Colonel, huh. Must have been a secretary or something." Loretta didn't react. She'd heard far worse. "Ma'am," Daniels said, stepping back, "I need you to exit the vehicle. I'd like to take a look in that case." "I'm afraid I can't authorize that," Loretta replied, still seated. "It is protected under federal regulation." Daniels' tone hardened. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle now. I won't ask again." As Loretta slowly opened the door, the past returned to her like an old film reel. She was 11 years old, watching her father, Reverend Hampton, being dragged from their car by state troopers in Mississippi. His crime, daring to preach about voting rights in the next county over. Back then, the handcuffs had cut his wrists. This time, they cut hers. Daniels moved in, grasping her by the arm with just a little too much force, snapping cold metal around her wrists as Deputy Coleman rummaged through the cab. "I am not resisting," Loretta said clearly, "but I do not consent to a search." Daniels sneered. "You don't get to make that call, Colonel." Across the road, a teenage boy named Jordan had pulled out his phone and begun recording. He didn't know who this old woman was, but something about the way she stood handcuffed, yet unbroken, made him press record without hesitation. Asterisk. In the trunk of the cruiser now sat the mysterious case, still locked tight. Deputy Coleman had tried everything, a crowbar, a pocket knife, even asking her for a passcode. Nothing worked inside. They also found a leather portfolio filled with pristine military commendations, Bronze Star, Silver Star, even what appeared to be an early draft of a Medal of Honor recommendation, but they ignored it, assuming it must be fake or stolen. She probably swiped this from a museum, Daniels muttered as they drove back toward the county station. Loretta sat upright in the back seat, her face calm but her mind racing. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to shout. She simply needed a phone call. Asterisk. Just as they pulled into the station parking lot, a black SUV with tinted windows turned the corner and came to a smooth stop behind them. Two sharply dressed men in military attire stepped out, one holding a satellite phone. The other man wore 4 silver stars on his shoulders. Sheriff. Daniel's smile faded as the man approached. "You're detaining Colonel Loretta May Hampton?" the general asked without emotion. Daniels blinked. "Yes, sir. Who exactly are you?" The general took a long breath. "I'm her commanding officer, and you just made a grave mistake." Asterisk. The moment the black SUV rolled to a stop behind the sheriff's cruiser, the air in the parking lot seemed to shift. A stillness crept in, like the pause before a storm. Sheriff Daniels stood motionless, his hand resting on the cruiser's door, eyes fixed on the tinted windows as they glided down in near silence. A man stepped out, broad-shouldered, poised, dressed in a crisp military uniform that practically radiated command. The silver stars on his epaulets gleamed under the fading Alabama light. He was older, maybe early 60s, but carried himself with the measured certainty of someone used to having doors opened, protocols followed, and mistakes corrected with a single word. Behind him, another man in a dark suit held a satellite phone, murmuring to someone whose voice was impossible to hear, but whose authority echoed in the agent's posture. The general didn't look at Daniels at first. His eyes swept the parking lot until they landed on the backseat window of the cruiser, where Loretta May Hampton sat, her hands still cuffed, her chin lifted, her expression unreadable. "Colonel Hampton," the general said, nodding deeply. "Ma'am." Inside the car, Loretta offered a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. That was when Daniels finally found his voice, though it came out thinner than he expected. "Can I help you?" The general's gaze turned to him slowly, deliberately. "You detained a decorated veteran, one of our most trusted officers, and you did so over a broken taillight." Daniels blinked. "She refused to let us inspect a suspicious case, claimed it was classified." "It is classified," the general replied flatly. "And it's not just a case. It's a secure transport unit issued under direct Pentagon clearance. She's one of the few authorized to carry it." Daniels looked around, as if hoping someone would interrupt, offer him a way out, but the only sound came from the low buzz of insects, and the soft hum of the satellite phone still pressed to the agent's ear. "She didn't present any military ID, just said she was retired. She didn't need to prove it," the general said, "because she's known. Because people like her don't need to speak loudly to be respected. She's earned her silence." Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "We had to make sure it wasn't stolen. There was a portfolio with medals, Silver Star, Bronze Star. One looked like it might be a Medal of Honor." The general gave him a look that felt like a weight. "That Medal of Honor citation was drafted and submitted by my predecessor. It was denied due to technicalities and prejudice, something we're now in the process of correcting. That portfolio you carelessly rifled through, it's her life's service. Every mission, every operation she never got to tell anyone about." Daniels cleared his throat. "How was I supposed to know?" She looked. He stopped himself, but it was too late. "She looked like someone who didn't belong," the general said calmly. "She looked like someone who couldn't possibly carry authority because of her age, her truck, or the color of her skin." Daniels said nothing. The general exhaled and walked past him, directly to the back seat of the cruiser. Without a word, he opened the door and extended a hand to Loretta. She stepped out with quiet composure, straightening her shoulders. As she did, the handcuffs still clinked behind her. The general turned to Daniels. "Remove them." Daniels hesitated. "I won't ask twice," the general said, not angrily, but with the gravity of 1,000 decisions already made. Daniels fumbled for the key and unlocked the cuffs. Loretta rubbed her wrists gently, then nodded to the general. With the faintest smile, "You got here fast," she said. "You trained me to be fast, ma'am," he replied. Across the street, the teenager Jordan was still filming from behind his parked car. Hands slightly trembling, heart pounding. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he knew one thing. This was history. This was a reckoning. Inside the station, officers had gathered near the front desk, watching from the glass doors, murmuring to each other. Coleman stood silently near the patrol car, staring at the ground. The general looked over at the satellite phone agent, who nodded and handed Loretta the phone. She stepped forward, held the receiver to her ear, and spoke only a few quiet words. "This is Colonel Hampton. Authorization confirmed. Proceed with directive." Whatever was being activated, whatever wheels were being set in motion, the sheriff's department wouldn't be at the center of it much longer. She handed the phone back. Then she turned to Daniels. "Do you know how many times I've been stopped on a quiet road like that?" she asked. "Too many to count. And every time, I've thought, maybe this is the one where someone sees beyond the surface." Daniels looked down, words failing him. "But don't worry," she added softly. "You're not the worst I've met. Just the most recent." The general gestured toward the SUV. "We'll take it from here." As Loretta climbed into the back seat, not as a detainee, but as a guest, Daniels watched, stunned. As the vehicle pulled away in near silence, the cruiser behind her, the small town station, the assumptions, the arrogance, they were all behind her now. Ahead was something much bigger. None of the officers could have known it yet, but within the hour, footage from Jordan's phone would spread like wildfire. Within a day, national headlines would read, "Decorated war hero wrongly detained, America reacts," and within a week, Loretta May Hampton would be standing before the nation at the Lincoln Memorial, invited to speak not because someone owed her anything, but because it was long overdue, and it had all started with a cracked taillight and a quiet refusal to be underestimated. Asterisk, it was just after 9 p.m. when the lights inside the sheriff's department flickered from fluorescent white to an uneasy dim. The atmosphere had shifted again. Only this time, it wasn't because of who had walked through the doors. It was because of who hadn't. Sheriff Daniels sat at his desk, staring at the blinking cursor on his incident report, unable to type a single word. Each time his fingers hovered over the keys, they froze. What could he say? That he detained a decorated war hero because of a taillight and a hunch? That he ignored her calm, respectful demeanor and dismissed her service as a fabrication? That the secure military case she carried had set off his suspicions more than the medals she carried? No sentence could erase what had already happened, and what was coming next would be bigger than anything Oak Ridge County had seen in decades. In a small living room across town, 17-year-old Jordan Mason refreshed his phone again and again. His video, just 2.5 minutes long, had already racked up over 40,000 views in the past hour. Comments were pouring in faster than he could read them. People from New York to Arizona were sharing their own stories about relatives who had served, been dismissed, overlooked, or disrespected. It was no longer just a video. It was a spark. But Jordan wasn't thinking about virality. He was thinking about the woman in the back seat of that police car, the way she held her head high, the quiet strength in her voice, the grace she carried even in handcuffs. He didn't know her name yet, but he'd never forget her face, not at the same time. Deep inside the Pentagon, in a windowless operations room lined with digital monitors, a different kind of conversation was unfolding. "She didn't invoke clearance," said a woman in a navy blue suit, arms crossed. "She didn't have to," replied the general, now seated at the head of the long table. "She still has top secret SEI status under active reserve clause. She was transporting critical archival material from the Heritage Preservation Program. We requested her assistance months ago. She never asked for recognition, just the assignment. And she still uses that old truck." Someone murmured. "She said it reminds her to stay grounded," the general said, a faint smile breaking through. "She said it's the only thing left that hasn't tried to outpace the truth." The room fell quiet. "We'll need to manage the press," the woman in blue said carefully. "This could spread fast." "It already has," the general said, gesturing to a screen behind him. News headlines from across the country flashed one after another. 82-year-old veteran detained, turns out to be decorated Army colonel. Community questions police after mishandling of military Hero America meets Colonel Loretta Hampton, the woman behind the silence. But while the media firestorm grew, Loretta wasn't watching the news. She sat quietly in a guest quarters on a secure military base outside Montgomery, her portfolio of medals laid carefully on the desk beside her. One by one, she examined each item, not for show, not for memory, but for something deeper. She was preparing. The Medal of Valor Thomas had earned in '67, her own Silver Star from Operation Horizon Wind, the handwritten letter from a soldier she saved during a rescue mission in Kandahar. Every item was a chapter of a story most had never heard, and fewer still had believed. Now, it was time to speak. She wasn't angry, she was patient, not vengeful, just ready. This wasn't about revenge, this was about legacy, and truth, and the generations who might never know what quiet resilience looked like if no one stood up and told them. Meanwhile, Daniel's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, civil rights attorneys, military officials, citizens demanding answers. Deputy Collins had already asked for the day off. He couldn't face the growing cameras parked outside the station. Coleman, usually the voice of reason in the department, had pulled Daniels aside that morning and said, quietly, "I think we owe her more than just an apology." Daniels had nodded, but said nothing. That evening, Loretta stood at the edge of a private auditorium at the base. A quiet ceremony was being held in her honor. No press, no cameras, just those who knew. The general stepped forward to speak. There are those who change history loudly with speeches, marches, protests. And then there are those who change it quietly, with decades of quiet excellence, with service no one thanks them for, with dignity no one gives them, but they carry anyway. Colonel Hampton is the second kind. He turned to her. "You didn't need to say anything yesterday. You could have walked away." "I did walk away," Loretta replied, finally stepping forward. "But I walked away with something they didn't have. The truth. And now the world's paying attention, not because I shouted louder, but because I stood longer." Back in Oak Ridge County, Jordan watched the live stream of her speech. From a bootleg link someone had leaked. He wasn't supposed to have access, but he watched anyway, wide-eyed, heart thumping. He wasn't sure why it made him tear up. Maybe it was how calm she looked, how powerful. Maybe it was because, for the first time, someone who looked like his grandmother was at the center of a story, not on the edges. Or maybe it was because something inside him changed when he realized people could make a difference, even when nobody believed them, even when they were invisible. And all it took was one person standing their ground. A storm was brewing, not in the skies above Oak Ridge County, but in the hearts of people across America. By morning, the video of Colonel Loretta Hampton being handcuffed on the side of a rural road had crossed 10 million views. But it wasn't just numbers or headlines anymore. It was something deeper. Parents showed their children. Teachers played it in classrooms. Veterans posted side-by-side photos of their own medals and shared stories they had never dared to tell before. The country had started asking a question that made many uncomfortable. How many heroes have we ignored just because we didn't recognize what a hero looks like? At the sheriff's department, Sheriff Daniels sat silently in the briefing room as his superiors arrived, state officials, legal advisors, and a public relations representative sent by the governor's office. There would be an investigation, not just into his actions that day, but into patterns, into complaints that had been filed and buried, into the way things had always been done. His badge suddenly felt heavier than it ever had. But 80 miles away, on a military base in Montgomery, Loretta Hampton stood in a different kind of spotlight. She wasn't on a stage this time. She was in a private room, seated across from a panel of senior officers and civilian defense advisors. They had flown in from Washington, D.C., and their questions weren't just formalities. They were the kind of questions asked when someone's silence might be the key to an untold truth. "Colonel Hampton," one of them asked, her voice steady but curious, "why didn't you say anything when they stopped you, when they handcuffed you?" Loretta looked up slowly, her gaze calm and composed. "Because saying something isn't always what changes minds," she said. "Sometimes, letting the world witness what still happens in silence is the only way to make the silence impossible to ignore." A pause. "You could have pulled rank, called in backup, flashed credentials. Why didn't you?" Loretta reached into her bag and pulled out a worn notebook, its cover frayed, the pages inside filled with neat handwriting and sketches. She placed it gently on the table. "This is from 1971, my first deployment. I watched a local interpreter get dismissed by a U.S. officer during a mission. The man had given us shelter, food, information, but the officer refused to believe he mattered because he didn't wear our uniform. That night, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't use my uniform to demand respect. I would earn it by living the values it stood for, even when no one believed I had them. The panel fell silent. In another corner of the country, Jordan Mason sat nervously in a quiet diner, waiting. Across from him was a woman in a grey blazer and black heels. She had flown in that morning from New York, representing a national media organization that had reached out after seeing his viral video. "We don't usually do this," she said, sipping her coffee, "but we want you to help us tell her story, from your point of view, as someone who saw it unfold in real time." Jordan's hands trembled slightly. "I'm just a kid with a phone. I don't even know how to write that kind of story." She smiled. "Maybe that's exactly why you're the right one to tell it." Meanwhile, back in Oak Ridge, the town council found themselves in an emergency session. Community members packed the hall. Veterans in uniform, retired teachers, young activists. Everyone had come for one reason. They wanted answers. When Sheriff Daniels finally stepped up to the podium, the room went still. "I made a mistake," he began. "Not just in how I treated Colonel Hampton, but in what I assumed about her before I ever heard her speak." He paused. A flash of emotion crossed his face. "I saw a rusted truck and an old woman, and I made decisions based on that. Not on facts, not on respect, and certainly not on the truth." He glanced down, hands gripping the wooden edge of the podium. "I can't undo what I did, but I can say this publicly. I was wrong. And I owe her and this community an apology, not just in words, but in action." The room stayed quiet for a beat. Then, unexpectedly, a voice called from the back. "She's not just a military hero," the voice said. "She's our neighbor." An elderly man stood up. "Mr. Carver, who ran the town's hardware store for 40 years. Loretta fixed the roof on the community center last winter after the storm," he said. "Did it herself. Said it was good to stay busy." A teacher stood up next. "She comes to the elementary school every Veterans Day and tells the kids stories not about war, but about perseverance." Then another, and another. The room transformed from a town hall into a living tribute, because slowly, people were remembering that they had always known who she was. They had just never looked closely enough, and as the council ended the meeting, one motion passed unanimously. The town would honor Colonel Loretta Hampton with a permanent memorial in the Veterans Garden, and her old truck, restored and shining, would lead the parade next Memorial Day. That night, Loretta received a call. It wasn't from the sheriff. It wasn't even from the president, though. That call would come later. It was from a 9-year-old girl in California, whose father had served, and whose mother had shown her the video. "Colonel Hampton," the little voice asked. "Yes, dear. I just wanted to say thank you, because now I know that heroes look like my grandma, too." Loretta closed her eyes. She didn't need a medal for that. She had already won something far greater, the power to rewrite what the world sees when they look at strength. It began with a single letter, not an email, not a tweet, not a comment on a viral video, a handwritten letter sealed with a wax stamp and delivered by courier to Colonel Loretta Hampton's home 2 weeks after her story captured the country's attention. The envelope bore an unfamiliar symbol, one she hadn't seen since her early days in military intelligence. A small, discreet emblem representing an international peace and diplomacy alliance she'd once worked with off the books. Inside was an invitation, not a request, not a formality, a deeply personal appeal. It read, _Colonel Hampton, the world is changing, but not fast enough. We need voices not just from the front lines of battlefields, but from the quiet corners of resistance where dignity is tested and character revealed. You once helped us broker peace without firing a single shot. We ask now, once more, for your presence not as a soldier, but as a symbol. The summit convenes in Geneva next month. Will you join us? Loretta sat at her kitchen table, the afternoon sun casting golden stripes through the blinds. Her hands rested on the envelope. In front of her, a cup of chamomile tea had gone cold. She hadn't worn a uniform in years. She hadn't spoken publicly outside the Veterans Center since retiring. But something about this moment felt like a closing circle, something that had waited decades to return. And so, 3 weeks later, a woman in a navy blue pantsuit stepped off a jet in Switzerland. The cameras didn't recognize her. The diplomats didn't expect her. But when she entered the conference hall, escorted not by security but by a 12-year-old girl from Malawi holding her hand, the room fell silent. The little girl's name was Alina, and she had walked 8 miles every day to school in her village. She had written Loretta a letter after the video went viral. He showed me that quiet people can be powerful. She had written, Loretta insisted Alina accompany her not as a guest, but as a delegate, because change, Loretta believed, was only real when the next generation was included in the room. As the summit unfolded, Loretta sat on panels with generals, scientists, peacekeepers, and world leaders. But when her time came to speak, she didn't read from a script. She didn't rattle off statistics or policy points. Instead, she told them about a rusted old truck. About how people look past the worn and weathered things, how strength often arrives in quiet packages, and how a mistake made by 2 officers in a small southern town had opened the eyes of an entire nation, not because it was rare, but because someone finally stayed to watch the ending. You see, she said to a room of dignitaries, it wasn't the injustice that surprised people. It was the fact that the woman they dismissed kept her grace long enough for the truth to rise above the noise. Back in the US, Loretta's story had become part of school curriculums. A national journalism competition was created in her name, encouraging young people to capture the dignity in unexpected places. Jordan Mason, the teen who filmed the original video, was now mentoring other students, having declined multiple influencer deals to stay focused on documentary storytelling. And Oak Ridge had changed, too. The town passed legislation requiring de-escalation and history training for all law enforcement officers. Sheriff Daniels, who voluntarily stepped down from his position, now worked with a non-profit focused on reform and accountability. He spoke openly about his failure not to excuse it, but to help others avoid repeating it. I thought I knew what authority looked like, he told a crowd at a training seminar, but it took getting it wrong to understand what leadership really is. One afternoon, Loretta returned home from her travels to find a package on her porch. Inside was a single item, her old army boots, but they had been cleaned, polished, and mounted in a glass case. A note inside read, _every step you took in these changed someone's world. Now, let them remind others where strength truly walks. She placed the case in her living room, beside the medals she had once kept tucked away in a drawer, not as a monument to herself, but as a beacon for those who had ever been doubted, overlooked, or dismissed, because sometimes the quietest story turns out to be the loudest echo. The invitation came quietly, tucked in the folds of an old journal. It wasn't official. It wasn't from a president, a general, or a news network. It was a handwritten note, 3 sentences, no signature. They're naming the new community center after you. The whole town will be there, but what we really hope is that you will be too. Loretta Hampton read the words twice, then closed the journal gently, her fingers tracing the leather cover. It had belonged to Thomas. Her late husband had kept it during his final deployment, jotting down memories, lessons, and prayers. She had only recently allowed herself to read it in full. This note, however, was not his. It had been slipped inside the back pocket by someone else, someone who had visited the memorial site she still tended each year on Memorial Day, someone who had thought to speak to her not as a public figure, but as a neighbor. Loretta didn't need honors. She had spent a lifetime understanding that true change didn't happen on stages. It happened in conversations, in classrooms, in quiet resistance, and in choices made when no one was watching. But something about this invitation felt different. It felt like a beginning disguised as a conclusion. So, on a cool spring morning, she drove herself back to Oak Ridge. Same old truck, same old roads, but everything else had changed. When she turned the corner onto Main Street, she had to stop the car. There were children holding up hand-painted signs, women standing shoulder to shoulder in quiet solidarity, veterans saluting as she passed, and beneath the bright banner hanging over the new brick building were the words, "The Colonel Loretta Hampton Center for Courage, Character, and Community." It was not just a building, it was a statement. The ceremony was simple. No long speeches, just voices sharing how one moment, one woman, had shifted something unspoken in them. A young Latina high school student named Rosa stepped to the mic. She had once been suspended for defending herself from a bully, and no one had listened until Loretta had met her during a youth mentorship event and personally called the school board. I learned, Rosa said with her voice trembling but strong, that silence isn't the price we pay for peace, and that strength doesn't always wear a badge or carry a rank. It sometimes walks into a room and makes people feel seen. Then, something unexpected happened. Sheriff Daniels approached the stage not in uniform, but in jeans and a plain shirt. No title, no ceremony, just a man with an apology. He didn't speak from paper. He spoke from memory, from mistakes, from the ache of regret turned into responsibility. I didn't just fail to see her that day, he said, nodding toward Loretta. I failed to see what leadership actually looks like, and I've spent every day since trying to earn back the trust I lost in 10 minutes. There was silence, then applause, and then Loretta stepped up, placing a hand on his shoulder, not in forgiveness alone, but in shared purpose. Later that afternoon, while people mingled and music played, Loretta sat on a bench beneath a tree near the center's entrance. She smiled as children ran past her, one of them wearing a cardboard medal around his neck. Rosa sat beside her, holding a journal of her own. You think we'll ever stop having to fight so hard just to be heard? Rosa asked softly. Loretta didn't answer immediately. She looked out over the town, this place that had once dismissed her, then doubted her, and finally honored her. No, she said quietly, but one day, you'll notice the fight looks different. Not because the world changed on its own, but because you helped teach it how. Before leaving, Loretta walked through the new center. Inside was a small exhibit, photos, medals, letters, and a digital screen playing footage from the day of the traffic stop. Not the sensational parts, the human parts. A quote from Loretta glowed on the wall. True power isn't in how loudly you speak, it's in what you choose to stand for when others sit in silence. As she stepped back into her truck for the drive home, a young girl ran up to the window. Miss Hampton, she asked, breathless, I want to be like you. Loretta smiled, eyes gentle. Don't, she said, be better. And with that, she drove into the horizon, not as someone seeking justice, but as someone who had already planted it, watered it, and left it blooming for others to find, because some stories don't end, they echo.